While attending college, I used to work at a movie theater. Most of the time I worked the night shift, since I had classes in the afternoons. On an unusual day, my boss asked me if I could train the new guy coming in. I didn't mind since I was already working the night shift. Not too many people came to watch the night shows, so I would be alone for most of my shift anyways. I agreed, and my boss left soon afterwards. It felt eerie to be the only one working that night, even though I'd gotten used to it. The whole building was silent. A couple of teens left after their movie ended, and it was almost time to close. I was playing on my phone when a guy entered. I asked him if he was a new guy. He nodded, but explained that he got lost on his way here, which made me a little confused, because he was 30 minutes early. I didn't say anything about it and just handed him a uniform. I wasn't going to put in any more effort than I needed to. I waited for him to change while locking the front door. When he came out, I started to teach him how to use a cash register. It was simple, and I remember thinking he wasn't weird at all. Next we went to the restroom, and I started to teach him how to clean the mirrors. While we were cleaning, he asked if he could play some music. I nodded, not thinking much of it. Instead of some stereotypical radio song, he started playing a song I'd never heard before. I don't know why, but hearing the song just gave me chills. I paused while mopping the floor and stared at him for a second, wondering how he could possibly enjoy this. It sounded like it came straight out of a horror movie soundtrack. When we finished cleaning the restroom, he thankfully stopped playing it. We went into a theater room, and I started to explain how we usually clean. A movie began to play while I was talking, one of the newest scary ones, which freaked me out because we were definitely the only ones working that night. I walked up to the projector room and turned it off, then came back down and realized the guy was gone. I looked under all the seats to see if he was trying to scare me, but he was nowhere to be found. I was so confused at this point. I called my boss after my shift ended to tell him about the new guy suddenly ditching, but he cut me off before I could say anything. Oh, I forgot to mention. The new guy called me an hour ago and said he wasn't going to make it. Sorry to make you wait for a ghost. I stood in the theater dumbfounded. If the guy didn't show up, then who was working with me all night? I could hear the familiar creepy music playing from an empty theater. Powering through my fears, I went to go check the projector room. I peered into the transparent windows and saw nothing. I was the only one in the theater that night. The theater seriously freaked me out whenever I had to work night shift alone. I never really got an explanation for the strange guy pretending to be a worker. But sometimes, I swear I hear his creepy music playing from the projector room during my night shifts. Truthfully, these past couple of weeks, it's been difficult for me to fall asleep. One of my biggest fears is the dark. And I'm not talking about a classroom with the lights turned off, with light coming in from the barely closed windows, but an actual pitch black room. Places where shadows are endless, and it feels like almost anything could be lurking there. It's almost as if I place my hand close enough to the emptiness, something would just latch onto me and drag me away forever. That is why I'm afraid of the dark. Sitting in my room while trying to fall asleep is horrifying. My bedroom becomes a whole nother dimension when the lights are off. When I finally manage to sleep, I'm self-aware of my dreams. The feeling of knowing you're dreaming, but not being able to wake up is terrifying. I'm trapped in my own mind, thinking I'll never wake up again. But somehow I always manage to grasp back into reality, even though my heart is pounding, and I wake up in a pool of my own sweat. It's one of the most relieving feelings to know you're still alive. One night I went to bed and began having a nightmare. I was in a hospital, and someone was chasing me. It was a woman with a disfigured face. I didn't know why she was chasing me, but I knew I couldn't let her catch up to me. But she was persistent in trying to grab me. After running for what felt like forever, I managed to lock myself into a patient's room, barely catching my breath. The thing chasing me definitely knew I was there, because something was pounding on the door. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, waiting for it to open the door as the light from the window slowly faded away. Suddenly, the room I trapped myself in was pitch black. I held my breath as I heard the door opening, not knowing what was going to happen to me. When I woke up, I found myself completely frozen. I tried to move my fingers, but they wouldn't budge. My eyes were the only thing I was able to control. I rolled my eyes to the darkest corner of my room to find a lady standing there. She stared straight at me, and I recognized the woman as the monster in my dream. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. All I did was watch in horror as the woman slowly stepped out of the shadows, revealing her horrifying face. She was looking over me, almost like we were having a staring contest. My eyelids wouldn't shut, so I was stuck there staring at her face as I tried desperately to scream for anyone. After what felt like forever, the woman stepped back and let herself fade into the shadows. I was still frozen in fear. My eyes were finally able to close, and by the time I opened them again, it was morning. The light from the windows let me see my empty room. The woman's horrifying face randomly appears in my mind sometimes. It's like she wanted to take me with her, but decided to leave me instead. I stay away from shadows at night, fearing that she might come back and decide to take me anyways. On February 14th, my mother's funeral was held. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep. My older sister and I were her only children. However, my mother was really estranged from us. When she was alive, we didn't have a close relationship. I wasn't sad about her passing, but being surrounded by shocked loved ones made me put on a mask and play along. Fake tears streamed down my face as I stood over my mother's coffin. I stared at her unbreathing figure, taking in this would probably be the last time I would ever see her body. While I was lost in my thoughts, a hand reached out and offered me a tissue. I looked up, and that's when I saw the most handsome man I had ever seen. Even in funeral clothes, I couldn't help but think that he looked like a model straight off a magazine cover. The mysterious man gave me his condolences. Then we began having a conversation, and hit it off immediately. Everything about him was just so perfect. We chatted for hours, until I almost forgot we were at my mother's funeral. Realizing it was getting late, I excused myself for a minute to go to the restroom. Upon entering the empty restroom, I began to touch up my makeup in the mirror, trying my best to impress the handsome man. Once I returned back to the graveyard with a fresh face, I realized that he had left. It registered in my mind that I never got his number, or any way of contacting him. In a desperate last-attempt effort, I tried searching up his name on all forms of social media, but no results ever came up. I started to realize how hopeless this was, and began coming up with potential solutions on how I could encounter him again. That's when my idea struck. Of course, it was so simple. That night, I snuck into my sister's room. She was breathing lightly in her sleep, probably worn out from all the talking we had to do today. I stood over her in silence, debating if my idea was really gonna work. Then I decided it was at least worth a shot. The next morning, I was the only person with a heartbeat in my house. Almost a week later, my sister's funeral was held at the same graveyard as my mother's. I wondered to myself if she would have liked to be buried so close to Mom, but she wasn't alive to tell me her answer anyways. I spent the funeral greeting the same relatives I had seen a week before, but they all wore the same sad expressions on their faces. I didn't care about any of them though. At last, the person I had been waiting for came back. the handsome man from my mother's funeral. This time his suit was slightly different, but nonetheless he was still stunning. I made sure to exchange numbers with him, which he couldn't deny. After all, I did lose 2 relatives in the span of 2 weeks. How they passed away didn't matter. All that mattered to me was I had the handsome guy's number. He left after we made plans to see each other again. Now I was left alone in the cemetery. I took a seat next to my sister's grave. In my head, I could hear her asking why I did it. All I could do was smile. I did it so I could see him again. For the past year or so, my life had been filled with misfortune. My boss fired me from my job after a small accident. And just like that, I lost my only source of income. After that happened, I began to feel extremely lost in life. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't predict what was in store for me, so I decided to find out. Hoping for some sort of miracle, I visited a small little psychic shop on the side of the road. A bell rang as I opened the door leading to the shop, and the smell of burning candles entered my lungs. "Welcome, dear customer," a voice shouted from afar. Looking over, a woman with silver hair and hazel skin appeared before me, with a sinister smile decorating her face. Something felt unusual about her, but I guess that was just part of her psychic gimmick. "I take it you're here for a reading. Please take a seat," the woman insisted as she led me to a table with the crystal ball placed in the middle. My first impression of her was that she was definitely not completely sane, but since I was already there, it wouldn't hurt to see what she had to say. I asked her what she saw in store for me, and then she pressed her face extremely close to her crystal ball. In your near future, you should stay away from other women," she claims, as if she had actually seen something in her crystal ball. I waited, as if I had expected her to say something more. But the only thing that came out of her mouth was, "You may leave now." I knew it was a scam from the beginning, but I had at least expected her to give me a little false hope. "Thanks for nothing," I grumbled as I paid her. She only smiled back at me. "You'll be back. They always come back." While waiting at the bus stop, I scolded myself for believing in something so fake. Sitting on a bench in front of the bus stop was a woman. I recalled what the psychic had told me about women, and oddly enough, I decided to not sit next to her. Just minutes later, another person arrived and took the seat next to her. I watched them out of the corner of my eye, but nothing seemed to happen. I rolled my eyes, questioning why I ever believed such a made-up fortune. The woman spilled coffee all over the man next to her. I was shocked. Was the psychic real? Or was this just a coincidence? Shaking my head, I took one look back at the woman, and deep down I knew what my answer was. With that, I walked back to the psychic's shack. Before I could even knock, she opened the door and smiled at me. "I told you so, didn't I?" We took a seat back at her table, and she told me another fortune using her crystal ball. "You should walk home today." I sat in front of her dumbfounded, but she just gave me a look that said, "I tell no lies." Grumbling, I paid her once again and walked out. It was chilly outside, which made it extremely tempting to just wait at a bus stop. Instead, I listened to her words and continued to push through the terrible weather. After walking for about half an hour, I was cursing the psychic. What happened at the bus stop was definitely just a coincidence, and what I was doing now was just foolish. Passing by a dark alleyway, I heard a scream. Biting my lip, I used my phone flashlight to uncover the darkness. My phone revealed a man getting robbed before my very eyes. I thought quickly and just started hitting the thief with my bag, until he thought the man's belongings weren't worth it and just took off. While catching his breath, the man thanked me. I still couldn't figure out why the psychic asked me to walk home, until I saw the man's face. In shock, I recognized him as my old boss. I guess he felt grateful for me, or maybe he just pitied me, but he ended up giving my job back after we talked for a bit. I was enthusiastic. After that, I returned back to the psychic almost every day. The strange woman told me the secrets on how to become successful, and slowly she became my secret weapon. Then one day, she asked me to do an unusual task. Go to this address, and make sure the person who sleeps there never wakes up again. After all the good fortune the psychic had given me, I felt like I was compelled to do it. She was basically asking me to commit a crime. But this was the sort of crime that could never be forgiven. I was hesitant, but the psychic had never given me bad advice ever. Following my gut, I left, deciding to follow her words. That night, I returned home with blood all over my body. I found police waiting for me at my doorstep. The first thought that went through my mind was that the psychic definitely snitched on me. I screamed and shouted at the men as they dragged me away, telling them the stories of the psychic who had tricked me. The police officers looked at each other strangely. Finally, one of them spoke up. There isn't a psychic shack on the side of the road. It's an abandoned church. In freshman year of high school, I was good friends with a girl named Lisana. She wasn't what you would call the normal standard of beauty. Her hair was never brushed. I never saw her in anything other than giant hoodies. And she never wore makeup, so her eye bags always stood out. But her appearance was not a huge factor in why we became friends. I befriended her because she was one of the most unconditionally kind and genuine people I had ever met. Unfortunately, not everyone saw the side of her I saw. Our classmates picked on her because of her flaws, and I couldn't imagine what their words did to her self-esteem. Despite Lisana clinging to me every day of the school year, during the summer of junior year we had drifted apart. She told me she was going on a trip somewhere far away, but didn't tell me where specifically. So when school came rolling around again, I was somewhat excited to see her. On the first day of school, it started like a normal day. While sitting in my first class of the day, I glanced at the door looking for Lisana. But then the most beautiful girl I had ever seen walked into my class. A lot of my classmates broke their necks trying to get a better look at her, while I just sat in my seat, with my eyes locked on her face. How could someone be that stunning? The beautiful girl sat in front of me, then asked me how my summer was. Of course, I was confused at the fact that she talked to me as if we were old friends. Do I know you? Oh, don't tell me you forgot me over the summer. It's me, Lisana. She said it loud enough for the whole class to hear, and we all silently thought the same thing. She looks nothing like she did 3 months ago. A group of girls came over to ask her what diet she did, what makeup products she was wearing, and how she transformed so quickly. All Lisana did was laugh, but I don't think she ever really gave them a clear answer. Suddenly, all the people who thought she was disgusting and ugly last year were circled around her. I couldn't imagine what she went through over the summer, but it seemed like some of my classmates had an idea. Some of them praised her, telling her she looked better than ever, but for others, I could hear the whispers under their breaths. They called her a freak, a fake plastic doll. I personally saw nothing wrong with what she chose to do. If it made her happy, it didn't feel like it was anyone else's business. However, as the days went by, Lisana began to change even more. Her eyes became bigger and bigger, to the point where it was kind of creepy. Her nose was unnaturally tall and thin, and her chin became so sharp it looked like it could poke someone. It almost looked like she wasn't even a real person a month into the school year. She was so focused on pleasing everyone that she didn't even look like herself anymore. At one point, I decided that this just wasn't healthy at all, so I drove to her house over the weekend to see if I could talk to her parents. As I stood in front of her doorstep, I noticed that all her once beautiful flowers on the patio were now dead, which I thought was strange, because every time I visited, I saw her mother watering them. I continuously knocked on the door, waiting for anyone to open it, but no one ever came, so I took the spare key hidden in one of their potted plants. Silently apologizing in advance, I unlocked the door and stepped into her house. No one was in sight, which was another red flag, because her parents' cars were outside in the driveway. As I walked down the hallway, a disgusting scent filled my lungs. It was worse than the decaying flowers outside, and it overwhelmed my lungs. Out of curiosity, I opened the door that seemed to contain the main source of the rotting smell. My hands clasped over my mouth, as I saw two adults laid out on operating tables, with surgery marks all over their faces. Taking a closer look, I realized they were Lisana's parents. Behind them was a cardboard poster, with yearbook photos of all the kids in our homeroom. On each of their faces were surgery marks. My assumption was that she was planning on how to use them to make herself even more beautiful. I scanned through the photos to find myself. When I saw my photo, I felt my whole body go numb. There were no marks on my face, just a circle, and perfect written in giant red letters. Everything seemed to click in my mind. Lisana wasn't trying to look perfect. She was trying to look like me. The room door creaked open, and there stood Lisana leaning on the doorway. My legs shook in fear as she tried to approach me, now knowing what she was capable of. I was actually hoping to keep you around, but this procedure would save me a lot more time. After I kept complaining about being broke, my friend had gotten me a job at a privately owned hospital. They were looking for nurses, and I had a passion for helping people, so this opportunity seemed perfect for me. Once I passed the interview without any bumps on the road, they asked me to come in for work the next day. On my first day at work, I was greeted by a really nice doctor, and I shadowed him for my whole shift. There were no strange occurrences, so I thought I had gotten really lucky with landing this job. Until after a week of working there, I was asked to work the night shift. I had no reason to say no, so I stayed after hours that day to continue my shift. However, I didn't expect the hospital to have a completely different vibe at night. All the patients were asleep in their rooms, so the hallways were completely silent, except for my footsteps. It felt really eerie to be alone in the hospital, so when I heard noises from the morgue, I played it off as just me being paranoid. But the longer it continued, the more I came to terms with the fact that I wasn't actually alone. I opened the door to the morgue slowly, peeking in my head to look for any signs of anyone inside. Coming to the conclusion that it was empty, I opened the door fully and stood in the doorway. One of the boxes was open, with the body laid out. Approaching the body, I quickly shut it and got out of there as soon as possible. The incident was definitely weird, but it wasn't enough for me to go home completely. On the way out of the morgue, I encountered a tall man in a black suit wearing lots of accessories. I greeted him, and then he put his hand out for a handshake. I thought it was a little bit odd, but still shook it out of politeness. When I took his hand, I felt like we made some sort of deal. Once I tried to look up to meet his eyes, he turned around and left. When he was completely out of my sight, I realized I didn't ask him what he was doing here. He definitely wasn't a patient, and visiting hours had already ended for the day. That was the last weird occurrence I had that night. Yet the next day, I worked in the dementia ward, and another strange event happened. Although the majority of the patients who resided there weren't really right in their mind, a woman who talked about a man in a black suit visiting her every night caught my attention. I asked her to describe him in further detail, and she described the exact man who I saw during my night shift. That kept me on my toes, and I had an uneasy feeling in my stomach for the rest of the day. I knew she wasn't imagining it, because I saw him too. But why was a well-dressed man lurking around the hospital? I continued the rest of my shift, while keeping an eye out. During my lunch break, I caught my coworker rushing to the dementia ward. When I stopped to ask him what happened, he explained that a woman had passed away there just a couple of minutes ago. I felt my blood run cold when I realized it was the woman who encountered the well-dressed man. Before he left, I asked my coworker if he had ever seen a man in a suit lurking around at night. He looked confused and simply said he had never interacted with someone like that after hours. He told me he would talk to me later, then rushed back off into the direction of the dementia ward. Goosebumps went down my back as I turned around and saw the man in the tuxedo. We locked eyes for a second. I stood there frozen and watched as he faded away. No way. Am I going crazy? These occurrences kept happening, so I confided my coworkers about my weird experiences. None of them seemed to believe me, and all of them gave me the same advice. He's not real. So every time I saw him, I repeated these words over and over. He's not real. He's not real. He's not real. Looking from the eyes of my coworkers, I knew why they thought I was crazy. Always mumbling to myself, seeing things that weren't actually there, and having strange thoughts. I was declared to be insane a month into working at the hospital, and my parents admitted me into the dementia ward. And somehow, I ended up staying in the old woman's previous room. The man continued to appear there every night, making me believe I was truly insane. However, the man visited me one last time. He reassured me that I wasn't insane, that he was real, but that I wouldn't live to tell the truth. He unmasked himself and reached out his hand one last time, and he finally gave me his name, the Reaper. When I was younger, I lived in a small town located in the middle of nowhere. It was an old and mysterious place. Everyone seemed to know each other. Neighbors tended to gossip to pass the time, and there were lots of small businesses and abandoned buildings. My younger brother and I shared a small room on the second floor of a rundown apartment. Our window faced directly to a forest, and within those trees was a hidden railroad. Sometimes my brother and I would jump the fence to play hopscotch in between the train tracks, despite our mother always scolding us for hanging out there. Thankfully, the train never came at the time that we were there. If anything, I noticed that I only heard the sounds of the train at night. I'd never actually seen the train in person. On a Sunday afternoon, my mom had taken my brother to the store with her, and I was left home alone. At this time I was only 7, so I took this opportunity to visit the railroad behind my house by myself. I played hopscotch alone in between the metal bars. Even without my brother there, I almost felt like I was being watched. Deep inside myself, I knew I wasn't alone in that overgrown forest. Within the distance, I could hear light footsteps hit the leaves. The air was very foggy, but in the mist I could see the silhouette of a person. He looked like an adult, and I could tell he was making his way towards me. As he stepped closer, the fog seemed to move past him, and I could clearly see what he looked like. The man was wearing an old-style conductor outfit, and had a funny little mustache that curled at the ends. Once he approached me, I stood there frozen, and didn't really know how to react. The conductor didn't seem to be a bad person at first, and if anything, he reminded me of my grandpa. A warm and tender feeling radiated off of him, but he looked like he could fade away at any moment. He told me that I should hurry home, and myself, being an annoying kid, questioned him. The man looked down at me, and I could feel the sweat build up on my back as his whole aura changed. He was no longer a friendly old man trying to warn me, but a terrifying figure that was giving me a threat. He said a sentence that made me back up a little bit in fear.
Child, the train might run over you one day if you're not careful.
I don't know why, but my legs began sprinting back into the direction of my home. At the time I was just a scared child, so I didn't even think of the possibility of him following me. When I got back home, my family was unloading groceries. My mom seemed to notice I was out of breath, but didn't comment on it. All she told me to do was to help put food into the fridge, and after that, I spent the rest of my day watching TV until it was time to go to sleep. At the time, my younger brother and I shared a bed. I slept at the edge, right next to the window. My brother had fallen into a deep sleep, but I couldn't seem to drift off. As I laid there wide awake in bed, the distant sounds of the train running reminded me of the conductor. An odd sense of peace washed over me as I fell asleep, listening to the train travel past my room. A couple of years later, I forgot about the whole incident and moved out of the city for college. However, I came back to visit my mother. We were eating together at a restaurant when I brought up how I met the city's train conductor as a kid. She seemed confused, so I ended up telling her the whole story. My mother stayed silent for a bit, then said something that still makes my heart beat when I replay it in my mind. You know, the train system in our town was inactive long before you were born. So whoever you saw was not the train conductor, and whatever you heard at night was not the train. My mother told me the real reason on why she didn't like my brother and I going to the railroads by ourselves. It was like the city's personal ghost story, the train of death, also known as the most efficient route to the afterlife, with all of its passengers being ghosts. If you aren't careful, the conductor might mistake you for dead and take you along for the ride. It was a late night, and my roommate and I were both in our rooms doing separate things. While working on my laptop, I usually wore my headphones and kept the music at full volume. I was in the middle of editing my paper, but paused my music for a second, and realized there was some sort of mysterious sound. It almost sounded like some sort of tapping. I looked over at my window suspiciously, wondering if someone was trying to get my attention. Using my index finger, I pulled down one of the blinds and leaned my face close against the glass. From what I could see, there was nothing outside. That's when I realized the tapping wasn't coming from my window, but from my restroom. My bathroom connected directly to my room, so there was no way my roommate had gotten in there without me noticing. I stepped towards the restroom and put my ear against the door. The sound was definitely coming from in there. Without thinking, I twisted the doorknob and looked around. As my eyes scanned the dim room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. Except it wasn't my reflection. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I was staring at a disfigured version of myself. My eyes were pitch black, and my mouth was pulled into an unnaturally big smile. We locked eyes with each other, and a blood-curdling scream left my mouth, which caused my roommate to come bursting in. Once she turned on the light, the figure in the mirror was gone. She comforted me for a little bit, not really understanding what had freaked me out so badly. I tried explaining the story, but it didn't really seem like she believed me, which I really didn't blame her for. I didn't really know if what I saw was real either. After calming down, I went to sleep and tried to forget the whole thing, although I kept staring at my restroom door and feeling paranoid the whole night. The next morning, my roommate teased me about it, which made me feel slightly better. I convinced myself that the horrifying figure was just an illusion caused by the darkness. After breakfast, I spent the rest of the day working on schoolwork, then went to go shower. Although I was a little bit scared of entering my restroom, I didn't want to look like a coward by asking my roommate if I could shower in hers. Even through the sound of the water rushing down, I felt like I heard some sort of laughter. I knew it wasn't my roommate, because it sounded close enough to be right outside the curtain. Beginning to feel paranoid, I quickly washed off the rest of the soap, wrapped a towel around me, and then got out. Fortunately, I didn't see anyone, but I did see something strange. In my mirror, the words, "I'm here," were written in the fog. Playing it off as my roommate pulling a prank on me, I washed the words off and tried to calm myself down. But no matter how hard I wiped at my mirror, the fingerprints left on it wouldn't come off. I observed them closely, and realized those weren't fingerprints left on the glass. Those were fingerprints on the other side of the mirror. As I came to the realization, a hand reached out and yanked me in. I watched as a different version of me was in my restroom. Meanwhile, I was swapped in their place, trapped in a dark void of nothingness. My clone gave me a smile, almost as if they were mocking me. Then it left the room. The horrifying realization of what just happened began to sink in, and I began banging on the mirror, waiting for anyone or anything to hear me. I could feel the insanity sink in, wondering if I was going to be stuck there forever. On the first week of summer break, my parents had planned a nice, relaxing trip out of the country for themselves. That left my dog and I home alone for an entire week. As they pulled out of the driveway, my dog and I waved them off. I had expected nothing more than to have a boring week house sitting. After we went back inside, the two of us spent the morning binge watching random movies. Time seemed to go by quickly when immersed in watching TV. And after about the fifth one, I realized how quickly it got dark outside. I came to the decision of going to my room to sleep, and expected my dog to follow. Instead, he sat in front of the back door waiting to be let out. I grabbed some slippers and a jacket, then opened the door and stood outside, as I waited for him to finish his business. It was exceptionally chilly outside, which formed goosebumps in my arms. I could hear trees rustling, but I had just assumed it was because of the windy night. My backyard had a fence, but it was short enough to the point where I could see on the other side. In the distance, there was a dark figure peeking from behind a tree. I stood there frozen and swore we had made eye contact. Luckily, my dog was ready to go inside, so I had pretended like I hadn't seen anything and locked the door as soon as we entered. I took a seat back on the couch, my dog jumping to sit next to me. Trying to forget what I saw outside, I turned on the TV and flipped to the news station.
Breaking news. It's been reported that a serial killer is on the loose. Please be sure to lock your doors and stay inside until further notice.
Sweat dripped down my face, and I quickly turned the TV off. That man standing out there with a serial killer on the loose? That was no coincidence. This was fate. My dog started to whimper as he realized something was wrong, and I was debating my options. Do I run outside and take the risk? Or do I hide upstairs and wait for the person to leave? I sat hidden behind the couch and saw a figure through the blinds on the back door. My heart raced as I heard the doorknob jiggling. They definitely knew I was inside. I ran upstairs with my dog in an attempt to hide. We hid in the closet of my room. Even though it was on a completely different floor, I could hear the exact moment the back door was forced open. Once they were inside the house, they took no time in looking for me. The footsteps up the stairs seemed to take forever. They walked loudly, almost as if they wanted me to know they were approaching. Once the footsteps stopped, I could tell they were in front of my door, and it slowly creaked open. The closet's blinds let me peek through to see what was happening. I watched them look under my bed, peek behind my door, until they finally stopped in front of my closet. Before they could open it themselves, I made the first move. The house was all mine for the week, so the pros seemed to outweigh the cons. The smell of fresh blood entered my lungs. The serial killer mentioned on the loose was me, but no matter how many times you warn people, some just aren't careful enough. When looking for a town to stay at for my weekend off, I wanted something that was beautiful, but not expensive. After hours of searching the internet, I came across a small city named Heaven's Acres. From the photos, it looked beautiful, plus the house I was thinking of staying at was right on the beach. I decided to book it, and the next day, I drove out. The drive was long and silent, but whenever I arrived at the house, I knew I had made the right decision. Upon entering it, I noticed it had some rather interesting decorations. There were animal skulls hung on the walls, and the carpet seemed to be made of some unique kind of leather. But the most lovely part about it was the balcony looking over the beach. I was a little surprised at the fact that I was the only one there. This was the perfect season to go swimming, yet the rest of the houses seemed completely empty. I ignored the obvious red flags and went into town to get some food. The grocery store's aisles were empty as well, and once I approached the cashier, I noticed she had a gigantic smile on her face. Her name tag read, Alice. "Slow day, right?" I asked as she checked out my items. She didn't reply, but her smile seemed frozen on her face. The rest of my transaction went quietly, until we made eye contact. Her mouth opened, but her eyes felt like they were disconnected from the rest of her face. The words, "Where are you staying?" left her mouth. I smiled politely and told her I was staying at the cute little pink house right on the beach. Instead of maintaining her smile, her face fell and she looked around nervously. She began muttering something, but it was hard to make out. "You need to leave. You need to leave right away." I gave her a confused look. "Excuse me?" Her eyes wouldn't stop moving, until something in her seemed to snap. In the blink of an eye, she was back to the weird state from before. With a creepy smile back on her face, she gave me one last warning. There's a reason no one's staying on that beach. I took my grocery bags and left as quickly as possible. By the time I'd gotten back, the sun was slowly going down, so I decided to have a picnic while watching the sunset. The scenery was beautiful, yet I couldn't get out of my mind what Alice said. Why would anyone avoid a place so alluring? That's when I saw something weird. On the beach, there was a pier in the distance. It seemed like somewhere people would fish, but at the moment, all I could see was the silhouette of a woman by herself. I watched her while eating my sandwich. It was a weird sight to witness. She stood there until the sun was completely set. Then suddenly, my stomach dropped as I watched her jump off, her body falling into the ocean. Without thinking, I jumped into the cold water to try and save her. I opened my eyes underneath the water to try and find her. But instead of rescuing her, I saw something much more horrifying. At first sight, you might have thought it was a human. It had humanoid features, but his eyes were pitch black, and it was so skinny his ribcage was visible. I tried swimming back to the surface for air, but I felt claws rip into my skin and pull me back down. No matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't make it back to the top. It felt like I was going to run out of oxygen any second. And looking down at it, I knew this wasn't going to be a happy ending. I pulled my leg up with as much force as possible and kicked her arm off my leg. After I was free, I swam back to the shore the fastest I'd ever swam in my life. Laying on the sand, I realized why Alice told me I needed to leave. In the middle of catching my breath, I could smell smoke in the air. Looking back at the beach, I saw 4 people standing around a bonfire with animal skulls on. I didn't stay there long enough to see what they were planning, and rushed up to the house before they could see me. The whole night, I kept feeling paranoid while looking at the door. And the weird animal skulls on the walls didn't ease my fear either. After bandaging up my leg, I decided to search up the beach and find out what those things out there really were. Nothing showed up when I googled Heaven's Acres, so I searched up drowned victims on Heaven Acres, and tons of missing people came up. That's how I knew this place wasn't normal. It began on a Friday night. I was at a party celebrating the end of senior year with my friends, when the topic of ghosts somehow came up. So naturally, everyone began sharing their ghost stories. None of them really stood out to me, until the quiet kid who I didn't even realize spoke up. He talked about the bridge near the edge of town, which I would be driving down later on to go home. The thought of that just made the story even more scarier. A long time ago, a woman and her child were taking a stroll along the bridge, when the kid accidentally fell into the river. The mother jumped in to go save them, but somehow drowned to death. Legend has it, if you drive there at night, you'll see a woman walking around, looking for her lost child. When you pull over and try to help, she'll lead you into the river and you'll never come back out. If you see a woman in a white dress, that's when you know to speed off. I don't know if I really believed it, but it still sent chills down my spine. Especially since I knew I'd be driving alone on that road later tonight. As the party slowly wrapped up, I was still paranoid about his story. But I knew I had to go home at some point. So I left at around 3 in the morning, not even realizing that it was witching hour. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as I approached the bridge. In an attempt to calm my nerves, I shuffled my playlist. But as soon as I crossed the bridge, I noticed it fading out. Instead, the music was replaced with distant cries of a child. Even after I heard the story, nothing prepared me for this. The guy from the party's voice rang in my ears. Do not step out of your car once you're on that bridge. I wasn't sure what to do, but I decided that I should at least be sure it wasn't a real kid, or else I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. After all, that ghost story was nothing more than a story, right? So I left my engine running and stepped out of the car. I stepped towards the bridge's railing and called out into the river. Is there anyone there? A voice from behind me replied with, "Yes." Once I turned around, I was faced with a little kid no older than 8. A hoodie covered their face, but otherwise they seemed unharmed. "What are you doing out here so late?" I asked him, crouching down to his height. He stepped back once I tried to pull his hood down. "I'm lost," the little boy admitted. "Can you drive me home?" It was a question, but the tone of his voice made it sound like more of a demand. Although it was definitely not a good idea to be giving out rides at night, he was just a little kid in my eyes. It felt wrong to say no, so I said yes and led him back to my car. Reluctantly, I clicked the unlock button on my car keys. When I look back, I can't even remember if he opened the car door. All I knew was once I invited him in, he was suddenly in the back seat. Before I started to drive, I asked him a few questions. They were basic ones, like where do you live, how did you get out here, things like that. Instead of answering me, he just kept staring at the window. It almost seemed like he was looking for someone. I gave up and typed the address of the nearest police station into my phone instead. Once we started driving, I could hear him muttering things under his breath. The words I could make out were, "Mama must be starving." My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. Something about that sentence just made me feel uneasy. As I looked back to ask him what he meant, a bright light illuminated the darkness in front of the car. I turned back to the road to see a woman in a white dress right in front of us. Before we could hit her, I swerved off the road. Luckily, I didn't crash, and the seatbelt saved me from any potential injuries. But the kid in the back was dead silent. My heartbeat began to quicken in panic, and I turned my head slightly, only to see him outside of the car, his hood completely off, and him staring me down with his empty eyes. "You'll make a wonderful meal for Mama." Standing in front of the passenger side window was a woman in a white dress, just like in his story. My foot stepped on the gas pedal, and I sped off that bridge as quick as possible. My palms were so sweaty, it felt like they were gonna slip off the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, it seemed like no one was on my tail. Once I got home, I called the guy from the party and told him everything that happened. The line was silent for a little bit, before he finally spoke up. This is awkward, but that story isn't real. I just made it up to scare people." That made me think. If those people weren't ghosts, what were they? For the past couple of weeks, I've been having trouble sleeping. I work in an office, and one of my coworkers caught me falling asleep at my desk. At first, I thought he was going to report me to HR, since I knew he really didn't like me, especially after I stole his promotion from him. Instead, he offered me some pills that supposedly helped him fall asleep. There weren't any labels on the bottle, and he didn't really explain what they were, but reassured me that they would definitely work. In a sort of desperate last attempt to sleep, I put them in my bag and said thanks. That night, I sat down on my bed with a glass of water in one hand and the pills in the other. If the price to pay to sleep through the night was some mysterious pills, then sign me up. I took the pills and laid down. Surprisingly, they kicked in as soon as I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I actually fell asleep at a decent time. In my dream, I was on a cruise ship. Standing near the railing was a guy with white hair and a tuxedo. My eyes scanned around, but there was no one else on deck. I approached him, since he seemed to be the only other person here. The details of our conversation are fuzzy, but he sort of welcomed me on board, and asked me why I wasn't in the ballroom. I was confused, so he led me to one of the main rooms. Sure enough, it was a masquerade. Everyone there had masks correlating to their outfits, except the two of us. We seemed so out of place that it was almost funny. Somehow we ended up separated while on the dance floor, and my new partner looked kind of familiar, even with the mask on. Once I thought more about it, I recognized his face. It was the coworker that had given me the sleeping pills. Then my alarm woke me up, just in time to go to work. I would be lying if I said it wasn't a bittersweet feeling. Of course, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. But my dream left me feeling nostalgic for something that never even happened. What was that? Normally, I forget about dreams right after they happen, but this one stayed on my mind all morning. I went back to work and thanked my coworker for the pills. He said he was glad they helped, but the look on his face felt kind of off. It felt like he was surprised to see me. Before leaving work that day, he told me it was most effective to take more than 5 each night. That night, I did the same routine, cup of water in one hand and pills in the other. This time, I took his advice and took more than 5 pills. After I washed them down with water, I fell back asleep in no time. In my dream, I was back at the masquerade, but this time I wore an outfit that helped me fit in much more. The guy from the previous night asked me to dance, which I accepted. While on the dance floor, he started to warn me. Getting too comfortable here isn't a good thing. Just look at your clothes, he pointed out, still leading the way. If you get too attached to this place, you'll never be able to leave. I didn't really know what he meant by that, but I began to feel uncomfortable. I was so caught off guard, I accidentally stepped on his foot. After that, everything seemed to go downhill all at once. The band stopped playing. Instead, the beautiful background music was replaced by heavy rainfall. All the partygoers began to panic and rush outside. It confused me. Why would they rather go out in the rain than stay inside, where it was supposed to be safe? I began realizing this wasn't any ordinary storm. A sense of dread came over me, as he said something else was coming for us. I wanted to leave with everyone else, but he grabbed my hand, and now we were the last ones in the ballroom. It turned from a lively party to dead silence in a matter of minutes. He gripped onto my hand and said we should dance one last time. Even though I never said yes, we started to dance again. His nails started to get sharper, and I could see dark markings crawling up his face. The rain never stopped, and I started to become self-aware. This was all just a dream, right? Then why am I not waking up? I was in sophomore year when my boyfriend and I got together. Anyone could tell he was out of my league. Everyone in our school knew him, and a bunch of girls would gather at the gates just to get a glimpse of him. Meanwhile, I was an average student. I made good grades, but I wasn't near the top 10. I was cute, but not gorgeous. But for some reason, he still chose me. I never doubted his loyalty, and the first 2 months that we started to see each other were amazing. It was like all the romance movies I'd seen, except 10 times better. All my friends said we were just in the honeymoon phase, but I didn't listen. I thought it'd last forever. But then he started to act strange. We used to walk home together all the time, but nowadays he would always stay after school. He used to always tell me about his day and what he did, but now he never told me anything. His phone's password used to be my birthday, but I realized he changed it whenever I tried opening it. No one would tell me anything when I asked, and it started to drive me crazy. He was definitely hiding something. I was sure of it. Whenever he started to avoid me in the hallways and ignoring my calls, I knew our relationship would probably be over soon. In the end, I stopped reaching out to him altogether, and dreaded the day he would tell me, "We need to talk." One day, I stayed after school for a student council meeting. I joined because he used to be student president, but he dropped out right after I started. The plan was to decorate the gym for the school's upcoming dance. Another girl and I stayed longer than the rest of the members, since we didn't have anything else going on for the rest of the evening. The girl's name was Harmony. She's someone I'd seen around school a couple of times, but never really interacted with. I don't know if it was because we were the only ones in the gym, or if I kept it bottled up for too long, but I started to confide in this girl about all the issues my boyfriend and I had been having. After listening, she said the only valid answer to the weird things he'd been doing was that he was obviously cheating. I was stunned. It hit me all at once. The thought stayed on my mind for however long I was decorating with Harmony. Now all his weird actions were making sense. Harmony left before I did. By now it was already 8 o'clock and the sun had already set. Once I left, I was greeted by my boyfriend waiting at the school gates. I tried walking faster to avoid him, but he grabbed my hand and said he was going to walk me home. The walk was awkward and silent. Whenever I looked at him, all I could imagine was him with someone else. He seemed to notice I wasn't acting like myself, and asked me what was wrong. Even though I tried hard not to admit it, I lashed out at him and accused him of cheating. All I could tell was his face seemed really shocked, and he tried to convince me I just misunderstood what was really happening. That's when I heard rustling in the trees behind us. I wasn't freaked out, because I thought it was probably a raccoon or something, but that was the most panicked I'd ever seen him. We took off running immediately. I didn't know what he saw that could have made him so scared, but I didn't want to find out. We eventually stopped running after getting tired, and we decided to hide. There was a playground that I remembered was near my house. It was a little creepy at nighttime, but of course that wasn't what I was focused on. At this point I was freaking out, and asking why we ran off. So he finally decided to come clean, and admitted why he'd been acting so strange. According to him, a stalker had been threatening to kill me if we kept seeing each other. At first he thought they just had a weird crush on him, but then he started to find animal hearts on his doorstep. Those times he stayed after school, he was trying to trace the letters back to the sender. The only lead was that they were in student council, but right now he was sure they were following us. My heart sank as he told me the story, but before I could respond, he put his hand over my mouth, and we heard the sound of someone crawling up the slide. We both looked at each other, then jumped down and sprinted back towards my house. We knew we wouldn't make it sprinting the whole way, since my house was still pretty far away, so we hid behind a tree to try and escape the person following us. Once they ran up, I put my foot out and they tripped. My boyfriend grabbed them, and then I pushed back their hoodie. The person that was chasing us was Harmony. Her face was bruised, and I could tell she was just as out of breath as we were. Harmony gripped onto my shoulders and told me I needed to run as far away as possible. "Your boyfriend isn't a cheater. He's a murderer." I looked back at my boyfriend's expressionless face. He told me to go home and that he'd take care of her. When Harmony and I made eye contact, there was a pleading look in her eyes. It was almost as if she was begging me not to leave, but I just couldn't stay. Not after she stalked him and threatened to hurt me. So I went home. The next day, I noticed that Harmony wasn't at the student council meeting. However, things seemed to be going back to normal between my boyfriend and I. He invited me over to show me all the hearts that Harmony had sent him as threats. Whenever I looked at the hearts inside the boxes, I knew right away. They weren't animal hearts. They were human hearts. My dream is to be the most famous idol in the world. Upon first glance, my life seems so amazing. All the fans, money, and complete spotlight. But when you look past those things, there's so much work behind the scenes. Hours of practice, sleepless nights, and judging eyes almost everywhere. I was willing to sacrifice everything for my dream. My family and I cut all ties, so the only person I could truly depend on was my manager. Even though sometimes he wouldn't make the best decision for me, he always made the best decision for my career. It's not like I had any other choice than to trust him. I gave up almost everything when I signed that contract to become a star. After my first 5 singles topped the charts for weeks, my company decided that I should release an album and get ready for a world tour soon after. Just the thought of it made me want to jump up and down. This was something I dreamed about ever since I was a kid. To promote my singles, I was invited to a TV show along with another famous idol, known as Phoenix. He didn't seem like a bad guy, so I tried my best to be friendly towards him. I thought I was doing a good job, until after we finished filming, my manager pulled me aside and started to scold me. Are you stupid? Don't you know gossip outlets love to twist the narrative when they see you hanging out with guys like this? My first reaction was to defend myself, but he cut me off. I'm just looking out for you and your career. The only person sabotaging you is yourself. I held back tears as he kept screaming at me. Once he finished, he took one last look at me and said, "You need to smile more. You'll never be a star with that face." The day the episode aired, it was revealed that Phoenix was involved in a drug scandal. On the day of our shoot, an employee found pills in his bag. Even though he denied it and acted like he didn't know how they got there, the damage was already done to his career. By association, people started to accuse me of doing drugs as well. Reading the comments caused me to bite my fingernails. I wasn't used to this much hate, since I've never had a scandal before. My manager watched me from the doorway, a disapproving look on his face. Then he repeated what he told me in the dressing room. "You should smile more. You'll never be a star with that face." I apologized to him for not listening, and it was the most satisfied I'd ever seen him. The next couple of months were a blur as I prepared for my album's release. In order to make it up to my manager, he demanded I put in twice the amount of effort I did before. I practiced for hours at the studio and almost never got time to rest. He controlled my entire diet, when I got breaks, and who I contacted. It seemed like a never-ending cycle. However, the light at the end of the tunnel kept me sane. Once I got this over with, I'd be able to go on tour and see my real fans. My manager constantly reminded me to smile, even if no one else was there. He called it practicing how to be happy. On my album's release date, I got little to no sleep. The pills I took caused my hands to shake, and my mind kept telling me no one would want to hear my music. No one thinks I'm pretty. No one thinks I'm worth their time. But my manager's words stayed in my mind. The certain moments I practiced being happy kicked in, and a big smile adorned my face. No matter what anyone else thinks, I was going to be successful. I was meant to be a star. My album would be a hit. The next month I went on tour. My first concert was in a huge city, with the biggest stadium I'd ever performed in. I hadn't slept in the past week because of how chaotic everything had been. My dressing room was filled with frantic crew members and makeup artists, as I rushed to put the finishing touches on my set. The entire venue was packed, and my heart rate quickened as I heard the cheering of fans through the curtains. My makeup was flawless, my outfit was perfect, and it seemed like everything was going to plan. Not once did I let my smile leave my face. I caught a glimpse of my manager while looking at my reflection in the mirror. He was focused on his phone, but I could tell he wasn't smiling. The voice in the back of my head told me to give him a permanent smile. So I grabbed the scissors the makeup artist left on my vanity. Even though he tried to resist, I knew this is what he needed. If I was happy, he should be too. My twin brother and I were supposed to go on a trip with our father's family. He was a nice guy, but we rarely visited him. When he did make plans, he usually only invited my brother, so I was stoked to be going too this time. Our uncle volunteered to drop us off. During the car ride, he told us an old story that he heard about. Apparently the lake house we were supposed to go to actually used to be a cemetery that got flooded during a bad storm. My brother and I looked at each other. We were both fans of the paranormal, so this was more exciting than scary for us. Once we got there, we thanked our uncle and approached the lake house. It looked pretty fancy, but through the walls we could hear the muffled sounds of the rest of our family inside. I knocked on the door, and our aunt opened it. She welcomed us inside, then took us to our room as we settled our things. Most of our family were in and out the kitchen, trying to prepare the barbecue for later tonight. Our dad told us we were free to use the boat for now, since our uncles only used it to go night fishing. He taught us how to use it when we were younger, so no one really said anything once we left on it. The only warning he gave us was to not get into the water, since there was bacteria in there. My brother and I looked at each other, wondering if our uncle's story about the underwater cemetery was actually real. We drove pretty far out. It felt good to feel the breeze in my face, until my brother suddenly anchored the boat. I looked over at him to see what he was doing, and it looked like he was getting ready to jump in. Neither of us had on life jackets, so I rushed over, and by the time I was right behind him, he fell in. Looking over the railing, I watched him sink down. I stood there, waiting for him to come back up and scare me, but he never did. I stood there for a good 10 minutes, until I finally steered back towards the lake house for help. I must have been speeding, because my dad stood outside with his arms crossed. In my mind, I began thinking about how I was going to explain what happened to my brother. But before I could open my mouth, he began to speak. "You guys couldn't listen to the one rule I gave you." Sweat dripped down my face. "Why would you let your brother swim in the water?" he asked me, and I bit my lip. How did he know what happened? We were too far out for anyone to see us. Before my dad could continue, a familiar face stepped out onto the porch. "Ha! I can't believe I beat you swimming back. You suck at driving the boat." My brother chuckled. I watched him closely. How was he here? Even at dinner, he spoke the same jokes he usually did and got along with everyone. I tried to catch him slipping up, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He even knew all our family's inside jokes. He sounded like my brother, talked like him, and even stood like him, but that thing was most definitely not my brother. I know this for certain, because I'm the one who pushed my brother into the lake. I watched him get pulled down, and heard the sounds of him drowning as he begged for me to grab his hand. The thing in this house is not my brother, because my brother is dead. I had recently picked up babysitting as a side job, since I was saving up to buy a new camera. My mom brought it up to one of her friends, and they decided to hire me for a weekend. They were going out of town for a wedding, so I was supposed to watch their son from Friday to Sunday. When I arrived at the house, I couldn't help but notice how it looked like a normal suburban home. It surprised me, because they were paying me a lot of money to watch him only for a weekend. The kid's mother opened the door and welcomed me inside. She seemed like a lovely woman. Somehow the smile lines around her eyes made her seem so friendly, and she had no gray hairs in sight. After we chatted for a bit, she took me upstairs to meet the kid I was going to be watching. Whenever I first met Evan, he seemed like a completely normal kid. His mom told me he had no special allergies or anything, and I just needed to make sure he was safe, and fed 3 times a day, which was no problem for me. After his mom left, Evan begged me to play hide and seek. Although his house wasn't gigantic like I expected, I still noticed some good hiding spots when I first walked in. As soon as I agreed, he began counting down from 20. I rushed down the stairs and made my way into the guest room, where I was meant to sleep for the night. The door was opened beforehand, so I just hid behind it. Granted, it wasn't the best hiding spot, but Evan was only 5, so I didn't want to hide somewhere that would take him forever to find. Once he finished counting, I heard his soft footsteps make his way to the first floor. I put my hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing when he began to approach the guest room. He walked in, but didn't automatically find me. Instead, he went towards the closet. At this point, he wasn't facing me, so I peeked my head out from behind the door to see what he was doing. Evan opened the closet and stared into it for a bit. Then he started to talk, and it wasn't like he was calling for me to come out. It was like he was actually having a conversation with someone in there. The possibility of an intruder being in there crossed my mind, but I never heard anyone reply when he spoke. Just to be sure, I jumped out of my hiding spot and surprised him. Evan giggled. Then I discreetly ushered him out the room and shut the door behind us. I told him we should take a break for a bit, then put on a kids show on the TV as I went to the house phone and dialed his mom. I explained the situation to her, but she just dismissed it. "Oh honey, don't worry about it. Evan just has an imaginary friend named Madeline. He rarely interacts with other kids since he's homeschooled, so it's totally normal." We both laughed it off. Then I hung up. When I looked back into the living room, Evan wasn't there anymore. I smiled to myself. He probably thought we were still playing hide and seek, so I went back around the house calling out for him. I noticed the guest room door was open now, so I quietly pushed the door open and tried to scare him by screaming, "Boo!" There was no response. I was about to walk further in to check for where he was, but a voice from behind me made me jump. "I'm right here," Evan giggled. "I was upstairs. Didn't you hear me? I ran upstairs right after you left." At first I laughed along with him, but then it started to fade out as I realized something. If he was upstairs, then who opened the guest room door? I disregarded it. I probably just left it open when we left the room. Afterwards, we played with some of his toys for a bit. Then I tucked him into bed. I put a movie on in the living room and sat there before heading to sleep myself. But I couldn't help but hear something. Grabbing the remote, I turned down the TV volume. It sounded sort of like a kid giggling. I went back upstairs and put my ear against Evan's room door. It sounded like he was talking to someone again. Remembering what his mom told me, I knew it was probably Madeline. I knocked on the door softly and asked if I could come in. He opened it for me, and of course there was no one in there. I told him to go back to bed, but he gripped onto the bottom of my shirt and begged for us to play one more round of hide and seek. I thought, one more round couldn't hurt, so I said yes, and he started to count down again. I made it sound like I was going back down the stairs, then quietly tiptoed and stuck into his closet. Once I closed the door, it kinda creeped me out, since it was pitch black in there. A faint light came in through the door crack, but I could just barely see. After he counted to 20, I heard him shout out, "Ready or not, here I come!" That's when I felt a cold hand with sharp nails on my shoulder. I froze. It brushed back my hair and whispered, "Can I play?" That's when I realized Madeleine wasn't imaginary. Halloween has always been my favorite holiday. I don't know if it's because of the scary movies, the free candy, or maybe even the thrill of not knowing who's really a monster and who's just wearing a costume. This year, my best friend and I had planned on going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood together. Halloween fell on a Saturday, so he was able to sleep over the night before. In the middle of our horror movie marathon, he brought up a haunted house that he heard about online. Apparently there was something in there that kidnapped people and stole their voices to lure their next victims in. Some people thought it was the dead owner of the house, and others thought it was some sort of monster. We watched a recording of someone calling for help within the house, but it didn't seem legit. So we made a bet on it. If there was actually something in there, I'd give him all my candy. If there wasn't, I'd get all his. It was in a forest within walking distance, so we added it to our trick-or-treating route to stop by. When the next day came, we dressed up, got our candy bags, and headed out. When we left my house, it was already around 7 p.m., so the sun was slowly going down already. By the time we made it to the haunted house, it was already 10 p.m. The sun was completely gone, and the only thing lighting our path was the moonlight. While we stood outside the house, I looked out a window and found a figure staring back at me. Chills went down my spine, but when I went to go tell my friend, he was too focused on finding us a way inside. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the front door didn't budge no matter how hard we hit it. But luckily, the back door was broken, so we just went in through there. The inside of the house was dusty and had spider webs everywhere. At first, I was skeptical of this house holding a monster, but I definitely believed it was haunted by something beyond my comprehension. I went to go look around the kitchen, but I was more interested on the second floor, so I made my way up the stairs. The first room I entered led to a restroom, and when I walked in, I was surprised that the mirror was still intact. I looked at my reflection to fix my costume, and swore I saw something move behind me. I turned my head, but there was no one there. I laughed at myself for being so paranoid. I quickly left and shut the door behind me. The next room I went into seemed to be a bedroom. A girl's bedroom to be more specific. I could tell from all the lace on the bedding, even if it was extremely dirty. Once I looked out the window, I realized this was the room I thought I had seen a figure in. Well, I was preoccupied with thinking about what I could have possibly seen. The door suddenly shut behind me. It was already almost closed when I walked in, so I tried not to jump to any conclusions. But I also didn't want to take my chances. So I left the room and got ready to run out of the forest as quickly as possible. When I got back downstairs, I found my friend staring down the basement. It had a big hole in the door, but it was too dark for me to see anything. He seemed so focused, so I asked him what he was doing while looking over my shoulder. I didn't know if I had actually heard anything when I was in that room, so I didn't want to freak him out just yet. He put his hand over my mouth and said, "Dude, don't you hear that voice calling from the basement?" I stopped talking for a second. I could faintly hear someone calling for us. Now I could tell he was serious. I started to get scared and told him we needed to leave right now. Suddenly, we began to hear footsteps. It wasn't coming from the second floor, but instead, from the basement. We could see the faint outline of someone walking out from the darkness. That's when we stepped back and crawled underneath the kitchen table. All I could see from under the cloth was someone wearing men's shoes walking around the kitchen, almost as if they knew we were nearby. Curiosity got the better of me, so when his feet were pointed away from us, I stuck my head out from underneath the tablecloth to see what he looked like. I screamed loudly. Even though his feet were faced the opposite direction, his head was turned 180 degrees towards us. His face had no features. It almost looked like a blank canvas. My hand shook as he turned the rest of his body around. My friend grabbed my hand, and we ran out through the back door. Even when I was out of the house, the unsettling feeling didn't disappear. That's when I heard it. A scream was being played on repeat. I looked around, but didn't see anyone anywhere. Then I realized where the source was coming from. He was replaying my scream from inside the house. Every October, a large amount of haunted houses open up in my town. A particular one that caught my eye was opening near the edge of town. The exact location was surrounded by miles of forest, so I thought it was an interesting place. Since all my friends were busy, I decided to go alone. I thought it might have made the experience even more scarier, especially since it was my first time at that attraction. When I arrived at the place, I was surprised at how empty it was. Lots of people online raved about how terrifying it was, but this wasn't what I was expecting at all. It was like a little barn house in the middle of nowhere, but it had a lot of cornfields surrounding it. My first adventure was to the barn itself. When I opened the door and peeked my head inside, I quickly covered my mouth to keep from gagging. It smelled disgusting, and I soon realized why. There were no animals in the barn, just feces and corpses. In my mind, I was really impressed with the level of decorations that the owners had put into this. I couldn't even tell if the animal bodies were actually real, which made me really want to gag. After silently praising them for their hard work, I realized this was just the start of the haunted house, so I closed the door and looked towards the other building. It had the vibe of an old ranch house, which really interested me. Although I've checked out almost every haunted house that's come to town, I'd never been to a southern-themed one. I approached the home with my heart beating out of my chest. When I touched the doorknob, it was already unlocked, so I just let myself in and found it decorated in vintage furniture. Something that caught my eye was a creepy doll seated on a table near the entrance. While I stood in the hallway observing the home, a woman in an apron appeared from the kitchen. She had red stains on her face and clothing, but I just assumed it was fake blood. Her first reaction wasn't even to ask me what I was doing there. Instead, she looked me up and down, then offered me an invitation to dinner. I couldn't help but think her acting was somewhat dull, but realistic nonetheless. In her hand was a butcher knife covered in fake blood too. So I just assumed her character was some sort of crazy housewife. I nodded trying to play along with her weird little act. A big smile spread across her face when I accepted. And then she said something along the lines of, "We're having a spouse for dinner." I thought the way she said Brussels sprouts was weird. After she muttered to herself for a bit, she looked upstairs. It was a strange moment of silence, before she suddenly shouted, "Evelyn, you have a new friend." A young girl with braids came down from the top of the staircase. I don't know how to describe it, but she looked so empty. Evelyn was around my little sister's age, but her acting was flawless. She grabbed my hand and led me back up the stairs. No words were exchanged between us, but the room we stopped at was a bedroom. I assumed it was her character's room, and she gestured for me to take a seat. I sat crisscross on the floor and felt a shiver go down my spine as my eyes landed on her large doll collection. The room was silent as I watched her lay a doll gently on her lap. Without saying anything, she began to rip all the hair from its head. The sight was so disturbing that I began to feel uncomfortable. Then her mother called for us to go back downstairs, and I tried to leave the room as quickly as possible. Once we made it to the dining room, there was a whole feast laid out. Although all the food was probably fake, it smelled so realistic. I wonder if there was some sort of candle that imitated the scents. I took a seat at the edge of the table, while Evelyn and her mother sat on the opposite side. My plate had lots of raw meat, and I watched the mother and daughter as they dug in. I guessed it was edible and took a bite. The taste was very sweet, but it made me feel weird not knowing what kind of meat it was. I excused myself to go get a drink, and the mother told me their fridge was in the garage. So I went to the fridge, but upon opening it, something landed on my feet, and I had to stop myself from screaming. Once I collected myself, I bent down to pick up the object, and realized it was a human head. His eyelashes were covered with ice, and he looked like he had very bad frostbite. When I looked closer, I realized he resembled Evelyn a bit, even though it was just a prop. His frozen face with its permanent look of horror really impressed me. My phone got a notification, and I saw that my friend sent me a photo of our group at the haunted house. The message attached was, "We came to surprise you. Where are you?" That's when I realized I was at the wrong house. Once upon a time, 3 best friends lived in apartment number 143, on the 5th floor of a rather large building complex. In total, the apartment had 10 floors, so they were right in the middle. When they first signed their lease, everything in the building seemed normal. The shower worked, there were no rats, and the rent was really cheap for that area. Everything was perfect. Almost too perfect. The 3 friends were respectable roommates to each other, despite sometimes forgetting to wash the dishes on their days. The only problem was their noisy upstairs neighbors. Late at night, usually around 3 a.m., there was some sort of noise coming from the floor above them. It almost sounded like their neighbor would randomly start stomping in the middle of the night. In the beginning, the 3 roommates sort of ignored it, thinking that maybe they were celebrating something. But after it continued on for more than a week, one of them got fed up. She went upstairs to go yell at the tenants on the floor above them, but no matter how loudly she knocked on their door, no one ever answered. The other 2 convinced her to forget about it, and so they did. However, this did not stop the weekly 3 a.m. noises. On one fateful night, the 3 roommates decided to have a sleepover in their living room, but it was ruined by their upstairs neighbors. This time, they decided that ignoring the problem wouldn't fix it, so the two girls sent the guy upstairs to go say something. They waited in the living room for him to come back. 10 minutes passed, and he wasn't back yet. Another 30 minutes passed, and he still wasn't back. The two of them knew it took less than 10 minutes to go upstairs and come back, so they began to grow worried. After over an hour passed, they decided to go look for him. Lots of scenarios ran through their minds. Maybe they're gangsters who beat him up for complaining. Maybe they're telling him off for us being loud too. Although they were scared, they decided that they couldn't just leave their friend to suffer alone. Especially since they're the ones who forced him to go say something. The staircase leading up to the 6th floor was dark and empty, making both of them debate going back downstairs. The stairwell was usually well lit during the daytime, due to the large windows, but now the huge windows only brought a sense of discomfort. Almost like someone was watching them, laughing at their dilemma. However, they pushed through the fear and made it up to the 6th floor. Once they opened the door from the stairwell, a gust of wind blew their hair back. This floor was unexpectedly cold compared to the 5th one. They counted the doors along the hallway until they arrived at the apartment directly on top of theirs. Once they realized this was the right one, they noticed something on the doormat. It was their friend's glasses. They began to fear the worst, so one of them started to knock on the door. She balled up her fists so hard that her nails dug into her skin and made them bleed. After no one opened the door, the other one reached out to touch the doorknob and noticed it was unlocked. With a confused look on their faces, they cautiously walked in. The format of this apartment was identical to theirs, except this one wasn't decorated with a sense of home. This apartment looked like it was unfinished and almost had no appliances. Standing in what would be the living room was an extremely tall woman watching wistfully out the window. She was so still that they almost mistook her for a lamp. But no matter how you looked at her, she was completely out of place in this room. Before either of them could say anything, the woman turned around and smiled. But it wasn't a warm and welcoming smile. Her teeth were stained with red, and they were extremely sharp. There was some sort of tension in the room, as her soulless eyes stared back at them. So they rushed out and ran back downstairs to the landlord's office without saying anything. They explained the whole situation to her, as the landlord sat there quietly. The landlord had a puzzled expression on her face, then said, "Girls, that apartment hasn't been rented out in months, ever since the last lady who lived there disappeared. Nothing could explain the noises at 3 a.m., or the woman in the living room, since the landlord swore up and down that she checked the security cameras every night before sleeping, and she had never encountered anyone that fit the description, or seen anyone ever enter the apartment on the 6th floor." The girl reached into her pocket and revealed the lost glasses of their third roommate. The landlord looked closely at it, but seemed to not remember them ever having a third roommate. To further prove it, she brought out their lease. Only 2 signatures were written on it, which belonged to the girls. The disappearance of their third roommate was so sudden, they couldn't even process it. When they returned back to their apartment, his room was completely gone, along with all his belongings. His toothbrush, his mug, and even his shoes were all missing. With that, they never saw their third roommate again. The 3 a.m. stomping had another pair of feet join in, and sometimes they swore. They could even hear screaming through the thin floors. But the scariest part is, they were beginning to doubt they ever had a third roommate.
Hey kiddo, Thanksgiving at my place?
My father and I have always had an estranged relationship ever since my mom passed away. After my aunt got full custody of me, he just seemed to sort of disappear. No one ever told me why, but I wasn't allowed to meet with him under any circumstances. However, once I turned 18, I received a text from him inviting me to Thanksgiving. My aunt kept telling me it was a bad idea, but I didn't listen. We decided that it was best to have dinner at his house, since it was cheaper than going out to a restaurant. I wasn't sure what I expected, but for some reason, a feeling of dread overcame me the night before. It wasn't strong enough to make me want to cancel, but it reminded me that there was probably a good reason on why my aunt didn't want me to hang around him. The next day, I got ready, then drove out to the address he gave me. I noticed that he didn't live in a normal suburban neighborhood, but more like a cabin in the woods. When I knocked on the door, he didn't open it. Instead, in the doorway was the most horrifying woman I had ever seen. Everything about her gave me the creeps, and she completely towered over me. Her face seemed sort of familiar, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. When she let me in, I made sure to make it known that I didn't know my father was bringing someone else to join us. He introduced her as his new wife, and by new, I mean like 1 month new. They hadn't been together for long at all. That made me worried that she just married him for his money. But judging by the state of their home, I just sort of assumed he wasn't well off anyways. The dinner wasn't finished by the time I arrived, so they just let me look around the house as they prepared the rest of our meal. On the walls, I noticed there were some framed photos of the two of them. At first, I thought it was sweet, until I saw an unsettling photo, sitting on top of a coffee table. It was a photo of his new wife, and a separate picture of me cut out and taped next to her. First of all, there was no reasonable way for her to get this photo, since my dad and I weren't in contact for over 13 years. Second of all, what kind of psychopath tapes a photo of their stepdaughter who they'd never met next to them? That's when they called for me, since dinner was ready. I took one last look at it, before returning to the dining room. Luckily, the food looked really good. Even though there was only 3 of us, it looked like enough to feed 2 families. My dad was silent, but it wasn't unusual for him since he's a naturally pretty quiet guy. However, his new wife was unexpectedly chatty. She asked me all about my personal life, including what school I attended, if I was seeing anyone, things like that. It was honestly a bit awkward and made me uneasy. When I thought back to the image of us together, it seemed like she was trying a little too hard to be close with me. I still tried to keep the conversation peaceful, because I didn't want to make it obvious that I was uncomfortable, since I didn't want to ruin dinner. But suddenly, the grandfather clock in the hallway started to go off. My dad's new wife's smile started to fade, and my father suddenly excused himself. Silence fell upon the room as he got up and went back into the kitchen. Now it was just his new wife and I alone at the table. Once we heard a door shut, his wife grabbed me by my hand and told me to come with her. At first I tried to fight back, but she had an unexpectedly strong grip. She dragged me up the stairs and covered my mouth to keep me from screaming. When she let me go, we were in an empty room, and I felt my heart rate quicken when she locked the door. When she looked back at me, her eyes suddenly looked exhausted. With her hands shaking, she told me we need to leave as quickly as possible. I just sat there sort of dumbfounded. When I asked her to explain, she gripped my shoulders, looked me straight on, and said she has no idea who the man downstairs is. I paused and asked her to repeat what she just said. She told me she'd been stuck here for over a month, and they were so deep into the forest that she couldn't escape. Silence fell upon the room as I tried to take it all in. That's when I realized his wife wasn't the bad guy here. It was him. I slowly and quietly opened the door. Then we tiptoed down the stairs together. When we got beyond the staircase, my father was waiting for us at the table again. He got up and started to approach us. So the woman just grabbed my hand, and we made a run for the car. When we finally made it, he just quietly followed us without having any sort of reaction to our panicked faces. I watched him through the front window as he stood there. After the engine was ready, I backed out the driveway, and we drove off. I looked into the rearview mirror to see if he had moved, but he didn't. All he did was smile and wave. I couldn't process what was going through his mind. What was the point of this whole mess? It seemed straight out of a horror movie, except there was no ending. As I continued driving, my aunt called me. My phone was hooked up to the car, so it automatically went to speaker. She asked me how my trip to the psych ward went. The woman and I looked at each other, and I asked her what she meant. My aunt seemed confused, and told me my dad was in a mental institution for having delusions. Somehow he escaped, and mistook that woman as my late mother. When I reported it, they sent people out into the cabin, but didn't find him. Knowing that he was still out there made it hard for me to sleep at night. It made me dread every Thanksgiving, because I would always get the same message from him, without fail.
Hey kiddo, Thanksgiving at my place?
This year, I'm going to meet my boyfriend's parents for the first time. They insisted I come over for Christmas, and I agreed, since we'd been seeing each other for almost a year. The only one opposing was my boyfriend himself. He only brought it up as a joke, and seemed reluctant to actually go through with it. I managed to convince him, and that's how we ended up driving out to see them on Christmas Eve. Why was he so determined to not let me meet his parents? The only thing I knew about them was that they were plastic surgeons. Hey, we're here. Wake up. An older man opened the door, and he introduced himself to me as my boyfriend's father. Oh, nice to meet you, ma'am. Your house is very lovely. Wait, what about this room? You guys just skipped past it. His father warned me not to go in because it was extremely dusty and messy. What's the point in keeping a storage room locked like that? You can go to sleep without me. I'll be there in a minute. Maybe his birthday will work? If they went out of their way to keep the room this secure, the password wouldn't have been something so simple. Huh? Where'd he go? He doesn't even talk to me about what he was like as a kid, and he won't show me any photos? This looks just like my old school uniform. What's his photo doing here? It's not good to snoop around. There's nothing interesting to find anyways. Oh, sorry. I didn't know. It definitely has to be him inside of that room. 0622. My birthday. That's the only other number I can think of. Why would his family use my birthday for their storage room? We're really sorry it came to this, but Merry Christmas. Every year, my family somehow manages to throw a New Year's Eve party without fail. Even if it's raining, or if the year wasn't that great, they've always thrown a huge party. The decorations thrown around the house made it seem so extravagant, but I know the real reason they had these events: to show off to everyone else. This year, I decided that I had had enough. Instead of having to force a happy smile, and greeting relatives I had no real connection with, I decided to run away. Not literally run away from home, but just for New Year's Eve. My friends picked me up just before the celebration began, and in my backpack were a bunch of fireworks meant for the end of the party. 3 of my best friends tagged along: Summer, Zal, and Finn. After talking for a bit, we decided we should drive out somewhere quiet and empty, blow up the fireworks. We came across an open cornfield, and there was a small convenient clearing, almost like someone made a path for us to go through. Finn seemed reluctant to actually go into the cornfield, but the rest of us managed to persuade him. Zal carried the backpack of fireworks for us, and we continued to walk down the cleared path. Within the path, there was a clearing. I thought it was a good place to set up for the night, even though there were still 2 other paths continuing deeper into the cornfield. But Summer and Zal seemed to really want to explore more. Finn and I gave each other the worried look, because we weren't really sure if this place was actually vacant. They promised to be careful, so we agreed as long as they came back quickly. Even though there were 4 of us, splitting up just didn't seem like a good idea, especially since this place was so big, and it was so late at night. Finn and I sat down on the blanket we brought, and chatted about what our New Year's resolutions were. He mentioned something about eating more meat, which I thought was ironic, because most people usually tried cutting down on that stuff. My main goal was to be less cautious of everything, but situations like this made it hard. That's when a gigantic firework went off in the distance. We looked around and noticed that Zal took the bag of fireworks with him. Finn and I knew that it was probably him setting it off, but we couldn't figure out if it was just a prank or if it was some sort of signal. We were about to get up and go after him, but 2 familiar faces made their way out of the extra paths. It was Summer and Zal, who both looked surprisingly unfazed about the firework going off. I also noticed that Zal no longer had the backpack filled with fireworks with him. Before I could point it out, we made eye contact. Normally, Zal's eyes were maroon, but now they were just pure black. I glanced over at Summer, and her light brown eyes were black too. To be honest, I thought it was probably just a lighting, and that I was being paranoid for no reason, so I didn't say anything to them. Whenever I brought up supernatural stuff, I usually got made fun of anyways. Finn yelled at Zal for losing the bag of fireworks, then said he would go out and find them. He grabbed my hand, and before I knew it, we were walking deeper into the cornfields. I could feel Summer and Zal staring down at us, but I didn't dare to look back. Their eyes just freaked me out too much. Once we were far enough, Finn grabbed my shoulders and looked into my eyes. He had blue eyes, and I had gold eyes, so it was easy for us to tell if our eyes suddenly turned black. Finn was also pretty tall, so he looked over to make sure there was no one nearby, and told me he noticed their eyes looked different too. The reason he dragged me away from the 2 of them was because he didn't trust them, and he thought we should leave them here and call someone else to get them. At first, I found the idea pretty extreme. If they truly weren't our friends, then we dodged a bullet. But if they were our friends, imagine if something actually bad happened to them after we ditched them. That's when another firework went off deeper down the path. We decided that it was best to put as much distance between us and Summer and Zal, so we followed the direction of the firework. Once we made it there, we found Zal and Summer sitting in another clearing. It surprised me a bit, because there was no way they could have made it all the way down here without us hearing or seeing anything. Summer asked us where the snacks from the car were, and we were both confused. They said that we followed them down the path soon after they left, and that we just went to go grab food from the car right before appearing again. Zal also pointed out that our eyes looked back to normal. Finn and I froze once we heard that, grasping how similar these situations were. Then I told him about the weird encounter we just had too. That's when we realized it was a mistake to come here, and we needed to leave as soon as possible. In the distance, Finn claimed he saw something coming towards us on the left path, so we went down the path on the right instead. While walking down, a bunch of fireworks went off in the clearing we were just at. We all looked at Zal and saw that he left behind the backpack. At this point, we decided the fireworks just weren't worth it and sped it down the path back to the car. Once we were all back in the car and ready to go, we watched as a bunch of fireworks went off in the part of the cornfield that we were just at. Finn hurried up and drove off, not wanting to stick around to see what set them off. In the rearview mirror, I saw myself, standing at the edge of the cornfield with pure black eyes. The other me held its hand up to wave goodbye, and I clenched my hand over my mouth as something pulled her back in. We ended up going back to Summer's house and looking up the cornfield online. Our faces collectively fell as we realized those weren't mysteriously placed paths. They were part of a crop circle, and the spot we were in was directly in the middle.